You know what a doppelganger is? Ganger? Or if we do it, that's the American doppelganger. Okay, that's how we say it in American. But doppelganger is like it's a German root. Okay, it means literally a double goer. And it's a look-alike or double of a living person. So you have like this is Justin Timberlake, right? Okay, and he's got look at this, and then you got who are these guys? Matthew McConaughey and then Nicolas Cage. Okay, so you got those individuals there. So I was kind of going through my mind of like who, like if I could pick out people that have their doppelganger. Okay. It's a German word, so you got to get your phlegm into it. And there was one example, like Ella Curtis. Okay, so she came to youth group, and then I was like, she looks like somebody I know, and so I was like, oh, that's iCarly. So for the longest time, I've been calling her iCarly and everything. So and then there's Craig's brother. Okay, who does he look like?
Craig.
Yeah, he does look like Craig. But every time that I look at him, I always see Aaron Rodgers. I'm like, dude, that's awesome. If you could just, we just got to get him a Green Bay hat, and there it is. And so. Everybody, at one time or another, you're going to encounter someone like, oh, you're my twin from long ages past. Like my dad, everybody says that I look like my dad right here in the corner. And even my brother-in-law said, hey, look at that. There's, that's just, I see Bruce right there. And then my mother, growing up, she said, you look exactly like Tiger Woods. So, do you see a resemblance right there? Probably not the money. So this is what I got. Okay, I got my hat and I got my driver. Okay, let's skip this. I gotta take off the glasses. Okay, so there it is. Look good. All right. Yeah. So. I'm gonna show up on the PGA Tour one day, and I'll wear the hat. Maybe they'll give me the purse along with it. But so everybody has their doppelganger. You guys have any other examples of people that you know that are kind of look like the same individual that's famous? I don't know. Anything that really pops in your mind? I remember when BJ, when we were down in Brazil, he put his hair up in a man bun. I was like, oh my goodness, he looks like Shang off of Mulan, right? Okay, so there's that one right there. But everybody has their little look-alikes around. We have a genetic makeup around us where we do have similar features. We have variations inside of our genes that allow us to have similar traits. Chins and noses and hair. Everybody can roll your tongue? There's a few who can't. Okay. All right, that's a genetic trait. Who has connected earlobes? Okay, we got a few connected earlobes. Who has hangy earlobes? Okay, yeah. So all of these are little genetic traits that are passed down from generation to generation. And what we're going to find out here in Genesis chapter 10 is we're going to look at some of the genetic history of the generations that followed after Noah. And specifically this genealogy of Genesis chapter 10 displays the genetic history of humanity and several lessons from their lives. A lot of people, when they encounter chapter 10, they're like, oh my goodness, there's some ancient Hebrew, Aramaic names here, and they're like, this is right when you get to chapter 5, 10, and on, when you start getting into the genealogies, people are like, oh, this is tough stuff. But there's a lot of meat here, and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from it. So bear with me. You're going to see a lot of great stuff happening throughout this chapter. So we start there in verse 1. So you got your Bible, Genesis chapter 10, verse 1. It says, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. So we're introduced to the theme of this chapter. It begins right there in verse 1, and then the same kind of thing is mentioned right there in verse 32. Okay, these are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations, from these nations spread out over the earth after the flood. So we have the theme at the beginning, we have the theme at the end. These are Noah's sons. These are their sons. This is all their generations thereafter. Last week when we were looking at chapter 9, it was kind of an introduction to this next chapter. It spoke of Noah's sons and their immediate descendants, and it finishes with Noah and his remaining years. And as we were looking earlier, we have a little timeline of what happened with Noah and his family. So here we have Adam. And when we get into chapter 5 and into chapter 11, we get a good timeline of how their ages were. So Noah was born. He had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He had Shem at his 502nd year, and then the flood happened right there 100 years later. And then you have this little generational portion right here, and this is where we start piecing the timeline together. So as we have noticed before, Noah, right here, for a total of 950 years, he would have been a contemporary of Abraham. Okay, so Abraham, while he was walking on this earth, he could have gone to the Middle East and say, hey, let's look up great grandpa Noah, and we can interact with them. That's why you had this history that was easily passed on from generation to generation, and you could have this generation right here with Abraham could have interacted with Noah and with Shem there. So it's not hard to think that they could hear an actual first-hand account of the flood and the devastation that would follow. So we need to understand a couple of things about these genealogies. So right here from Shem and on, that's going to be the main genealogy that we're going to look at today. But there are 3 things that we need to understand about these genealogies. Number 1 is that it's an inimitable. I must have ate like something allergic here. Inimitable format, and this isn't your typical genealogy. Okay, that's what we mean by that word. So in your typical genealogy, you would have the begats. You say, Arsenio Inion begat Bruce Inion, and Bruce Inion begat BJ Inion, and Paige Inion, and Ellie Inion. That would be the typical kind of genealogy. But the one that we find right here in chapter 10, it gives the names and where they moved and the places they established, but they don't give the begats and the ages that they were. So it's kind of not your typical genealogy. The second thing that we need to know here is that it's incomplete. So you see a lot of nations that are not mentioned in this chapter. You have Edom, Ammon, and Moab. They were major civilizations. You have the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Moabites. You recall that Ruth was a Moabitess. But these are not mentioned here in this chapter. And then the third thing that I notice here is that identification is very difficult. So when we read through this chapter, you're going to encounter a lot of interesting names. Okay, a lot of nations, they will change their language, the customs, the titles, and even their genetic composition as they have different kind of genes passed along from generation. You see a change in these things. So if I came up to you and I said, okay, this last name right here is Yanam, you would have no idea who is this talking about. But my family would understand that this is actually the name Inion. Okay, but this is the Spanish kind of version, Spanish variant of our last name. So this would actually be the name that they would write back in the Spanish colonial days, when the Spanish were in control of the Philippines. They would write it with Y-N with the tilde N-O-N after that. But if you just looked at that normally, you'd be like, well, who's this talking about? You wouldn't understand. So from generation to generation, you see kind of these variations of names. You see people who come from Germany, and when they come to America, they would anglicize their name so that it didn't look so Germanized. It happens a lot as you go from one culture to another. And so what you see happening here in chapter 10, you'll see these major, huge, long names, and you're like, this makes no sense. But it made sense to the people who were back then, but in time, these names would change, and so there was a better understanding as people transitioned from culture to culture, language to language, and custom to custom. So understanding these names would be very, very difficult. So you got to keep those three things in mind as we read through this chapter. So clear as mud. All right, let's move on. Chapter 10 introduces us in verses 2 through 5, the sons of Japheth. That's verses 2 through 5, and this is where we see the Gentiles and most of those who we would consider of European ancestry. So, verses 2 through 5, it says, the sons of Japheth, and bear with me, a lot of names here. You have Gomer, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Taras. The sons of Gomer was Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan is Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and the Rodanim. And from these maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. So you got Japheth coming along. Okay, so we're moving in a different order. So usually we go Shem, Ham, Japheth, but now we go Japheth, Ham, Shem. You start with the youngest right here, Japheth, and interestingly, as you go along, he seems to be identified with a number of legendary figures. So the Romans come along and they recognize this great character from their history, and they called him Jupiter. You have Iapetus of Greek legend and Iapeti in India, and most of these would migrate into Europe and some into Persia and into India. So they have this generational history, and they look back and they recognize this great man of honor. It was Japheth, and so they incorporated this into their culture, into their language, into their customs there. There are a couple others that are mentioned here. You see the name Gomer, okay? So not like Gomer Pyle, but Gomer. Okay, so Gomer is associated with the area known as the Samaria, okay? North of the Black Sea, where we get the word Crimea. Okay, of his sons, the most familiar of his names is Ashkenaz. You see Ashkenaz right there in verse 3, where we get our modern day Germanic Ashkenazi Jews. So the sons of Japheth, they went around, and most of them would settle right here into Europe and the area that is north of the Black Sea. So you've got Turkey right there. So right there's the Black Sea up north of there. So if you have European ancestry, you will get your genetic lineage from the sons of Japheth. So you can say great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa was Japheth along the way. Bill Cooper, in his book, it's called After the Flood, he mentions that in this whole entire chapter, there's going to be about 75 countries mentioned here, and they will trace all of their lineage, all of their heritage back to these three individuals. So if you go to some of these ancient areas, they will say, okay, there's somebody in our history named Japheth or Iapeti or Jupiter, and they will trace their history back then. So this brings into mind something very important, okay? Because today's world population hovers around 7 billion. Okay? Today, the world population grows at about 1% every year. This is the important thing to understand. If evolution is true, and Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000 years with a growth rate of 0.1% or 2.2 children per family, the world population would be 1 trillion. Okay, if the world, let's put this in regular terms. If the world was 200,000 years old and humans were around for 200,000 years, that would be the population of the earth right now. It is not possible for the evolutionary time scale to be true. Even if there were a 0.01% growth rate, there would be trillions of graves, but the graves have never been found. However, if 8 people got off the ark 4,400 years ago with an average growth rate of only 0.47%, accounting for disease, famine, and war, the world population would be the same as it is today. It's not possible to have the current population if evolution is true. But since we believe the Bible, and believe 4,400 years ago, there was a great flood, 8 people stepped off the ark, you can do the math, it works out to 7 billion today. Look at this little chart right here, and there's a little lesson behind all this, that the Bible teaches equality. Okay, 4,400 years ago, 8 people stepped off the ark. You can do the math just by simple understanding, by reckoning right there, and you can come up with that number today. But the Bible teaches equality. You know, in the news today, there's a lot of news about inequality. That's why you got a bunch of these NFL guys on their knees during the national anthem. They're trying to address inequality. But if you believe biblical Christianity, it teaches that we are all of one blood. There's no race divisions. You know, we're all just different shades of brown. I've never seen a person who is pure white. Okay? Or somebody who is pure black. We're just all different shades of brown. And that's what the Bible says. We are all of one blood. It says in Acts 17:26, God has made of one blood all the nations of men. At the very core of biblical Christianity is equality. But if you go back to evolutionary biology, and if you go back to the core of what evolution teaches, look at this, the title of Mr. Darwin's book. You only read usually the first part, the origin of species by means of natural selection. We ignore the second part. It says the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Inherently, at the very core of what evolutionary biology teaches is that races are unequal. There's some preferred ones and there's unpreferred ones. You just go back and tell your biology teacher, well, sorry, I didn't mean that. You didn't mean a good one here. I'm sorry. Okay, we got a good one, but you know, your college biology teacher goes along and has that basis of evolutionary thinking, atheistic philosophy, which is not John. We got a good one. All right. What happens here is that you go back to them and say, explain this title to me. Why are we teaching something that we have favored races and we got lower races? What's going on? But biblical Christianity will always teach we're just different shades of brown. And we're all equal in God's sight. You step at the foot of the cross, the ground is equal right then and there. The full verse of Acts 17:26, I want you guys to look at that, put that little mark in your Bible. It says, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. You see that? He says he has appointed them. We're all of one blood, and he has allowed these individuals. So yes, we have some darker colored individuals in this one area. We have lighter skinned people. God has appointed those things. It wasn't evolutionary biology. It wasn't something from a natural selection or individuals being the survival of the fittest in there. It was God has appointed these things to happen. So you have the sons of Japheth here. These are Gentiles. This is where a lot of us will get our European ancestry. Okay, so secondly, you got the sons of Ham. That sounds good right now. A little bit of ham sandwich. I want to be a son of Ham. Okay, but this is a Gentile of Middle Eastern and Asiatic ancestry. You got some major names right here, and we're not going to just skip over these names because they're long. We're going to read all of them, okay? So chapter 10, verse 6 through 20. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Ooh, some familiar ones there. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sapta, Rama, and Sabteka, the sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew up to be a mighty warrior on the earth, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom, here's some familiar names: Babylon, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and Shinar. And from land he went to Assyria. We built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ur, Calah, and Resen, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Mizraim was the father of the Luddites, the Amalekites, the Lehavites, the Naphthalites, the Pathrusites, the Casluhites, from whom the Philistines came, and the Caphtorites. Cain was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and from the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. From the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and their nations. So let's do a little bit of definition right here. One of the names that pops up here is the name Cush. Okay, used elsewhere in the Bible for Ethiopia. Mizraim is Egypt, and Put may be Libya. The descendants of Ham, located in areas we'd identify as Egypt, Palestine, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. You see one big name that is mentioned there. You have Nimrod. He's described as a mighty one of earth. This would suggest a warrior. Some translations say a mighty hunter before the Lord. It is translated mighty men in 1 Kings 1, 8, and 10. And instead of being a sportsman, like a hunter, he is described as a tyrant bent on conquering and destroying. He is described as being rebellious. As one of his main cities was Babylon, it is better translated as a mighty hunter in the face of the Lord. Okay? So there's a difference between a mighty hunter before the Lord and then, and according to the original Hebrew language, in the face. You know, somebody's in your face, it's like you're opposing them, you're rebellious. This is the description of who Nimrod is in this chapter. He's in the face of the Lord. You also have Canaan. The Canaanites mentioned there, and that's where the major portion of the promised land, the Holy Land, is situated. These sons of Canaan would settle right there in Gaza Strip and up into northern Palestine and Syria, right there. You also have the name of Heth mentioned in this chapter. It gives rise to the Hittites. In cuneiform script, this sometimes reads Kitte, okay, where we get the more recent term Cathay. These would become the Chinese people. Okay, so you read the Hittites, They would eventually spread across Asia and settle right there in China. So you read Hittites, how would you think? The Chinese people. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into chapter 11. Then you also have the Sinites, from where we get our modern day word Sino, like the Sino-American relations or the Sino-Japanese war. It refers to East Asian. It refers to Japanese. So you have the sons of Ham. You have more of an Asiatic history and Asiatic ancestry mentioned here. The sons of Ham would be Canaan. They would be Nimrod. These would be people who would oppose the people of God. And God had a purpose and a plan even for these individuals. These individuals who would oppose the chosen people of the Shemites, or the Semites, or the Jews. There's a lesson here. There's a purpose for opposition. God created these people, and there was a purpose for them within his plan. You take, for example, Nebuchadnezzar. Read about him all throughout the Old Testament, and he would commit some of the greatest atrocities against the people of this earth and against the Jews. They would ransack the city of Jerusalem, starve them out. It would be a terrible, terrible time. He would institute him as king over the world. This is where we read in the book of Daniel. He forced everybody to bow before his image several times a day. And these three guys, by the name of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they would not bow their knee before the Lord, they would bow their knee before the Lord, but they would not bow before Nebuchadnezzar, and they would be punished for that. That's the same guy. And it's interesting as you read in Jeremiah 27, verse 6, it says, God describes Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. Wow. You have Paul in the New Testament describing himself as the servant of God, but now God comes along here in Jeremiah and says, this guy who just ransacked your city, he's my servant. Wouldn't that be just crazy to read as a Jew? That God calls this guy my servant. Now, whether these kings admitted it or not, they were put in positions of authority by the hand of God. God put Nebuchadnezzar there to accomplish his will. As such, they were God's servants, God's agents, and through their decisions, they knowingly or unknowingly ended up serving God's purposes in history. If God is the King of all kings and rulers in the modern world, what does this say about today's motley and scary group of leaders? Ultimately, God is in control in spite of our fierce opposition and apprehension. He will use them and us to fulfill his ends, move history forward, and he will bring many to him in the process. It is our responsibility to pray for this great outworking of God's plan, whether we understand it or not. This in no way negates the need for resistance or even war on our parts. It just means that we don't always understand the higher purposes of the unfolding of history. And with God, we can seek to know our personal part in it, whatever that is. Yeah, so there's a lot of leaders we don't like. A lot of them that we would oppose. But God comes along and says, you're my servant. They're just moving history along. So it's important for us to stop and pray and say, hey God, there's a purpose in all of this, and Kim Jong-un, he's a part of it. So let me see my part in this world. Let me see my part in your perfect plan for this world. There's a purpose even for opposition. Even in your daily life, there's a reason why God has allowed this struggle to happen to you. There's a reason why there's difficulty. And it behooves us to stop and say, God, what is your purpose in all of this? I'm going to trust you that you have a plan for everything and everyone who enters into my life. There's a third lesson here. This comes from the sons of Shem. We recall that Shem would be the father of the Shemites or the Semites, the Jews. Verse 21 to 31, and these are the Jews and the Middle Eastern Asiatic, those who have Middle Eastern Asiatic ancestry. Or no, the Jews and Middle Eastern peoples. Shem, like I said before, he's usually listed first, but here he's listed as the last one, so that the narrative can move straight into chapter 11 and get into the Tower of Babel. So let's look right here, the Semites, verse 21. The sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The son of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. Joktan was the father of Almodad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Zerah, Hadoram, Uzal, Diklah, Opal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Mesha towards Sephar in the eastern hill country. These are also the sons of Shem by their clans and languages and their territories and nations. So we got the Shemites, or the Semites mentioned here, and the ancestor of all of them. They would inhabit this main area right here. You have Eber, the ancestor of the Hebrews. So you notice the name right here. This is kind of like one of those name changes we were talking about. So you have Eber, and so oftentimes that first letter of the alphabet would be kind of silent. So you have Heber, Eber, Hebrews, like that. So kind of see the connection right there. You have Lud and Aram mentioned there. Lud was Lydia, and from Aram we get the language Aramaic. That's what Jesus spoke here on this earth. And he spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. You have Asher mentioned here. He's the father of the Assyrians. You have Arphaxad, who's the bloodline that eventually leads to Jesus. You'll see that when you get into Matthew and into Luke, where it mentions Jesus' lineage, and so you have Arphaxad, who's the bloodline leading to him. You also have Peleg mentioned here, and his name means division. For in his days the earth was divided. It refers to the division of the peoples of the world, or by the confusion of their language. So during the time of Peleg, he would witness the division of the world. You would see Babel mentioned at this point. Or perhaps this was a geopolitical division. You start seeing people separating off into language and into cultural, into political divisions. Or perhaps this was a continental division. Okay, so possibly at the Tower of Babel, we'll talk about that next week. You start seeing the dividing of people into language groups, things like that. Or perhaps this was a continental vision, and this is like from some of the creation authors. They talk about that during the time after Noah, you had a sort of ice age, and so this major portion of the northern hemisphere would have been frozen, down here would have been frozen, and then the land masses would have been, actually you would have more land that you could walk across, because all the water would be kind of frozen here in this area. And then that is when you could have people migrating from this area across this little land bridge over into North America, spread all throughout the North American continent into South America. You could have animals migrating down here over these little portions of land, and the water was frozen when you had all these mats of debris coming out of the Great Flood, and they could migrate over here to Australia. And then from these creationist authors, they believe that during the time of Peleg, that's when these masses of water, masses of ice started melting, and that's when you started seeing the division or the separation off into different continents, and then start seeing the division of peoples and of animal groups into these new territories that we see today. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we get into the Tower of Babel. But this last little name that we mentioned right here is Joktan. Okay, and that means to shorten. If you notice what happens at this point, so Joktan would be a brother of Reu, okay, son of Peleg. They would live for 239 years. You notice what happens after Eber. You have long lifespans, okay, come all the way up to here, and then all of a sudden it just seems like people's lifespans getting shorter. So Mr. Joktan comes along, and his name means to shorten. So his life is short. This is one of the lessons that I learned from this. Life is short. Life is short. Take advantage of every opportunity that you have on this earth. Anytime that you have the opportunity to encourage someone or love someone, take it. There was a little video clip, and it comes from CBS News. Don't usually watch it, but they have a great little program that comes after every broadcast, and it's on the road, and they share these really great stories. But here's this guy, old man, who lost his wife, and just the difficulty that he had in the loss of this, but just through his experience, God provided to him a individual who would bring about some hope and some joy to his life. Of course, this is taken from a liberal news source, so they would not detail the religious Christian aspects of the story, so there is an underlying Christian theme to this, and they'll actually mention that at the end of the clip, but it just shows you, life is short, but sometimes hope is found in some great little places. So here, let's take a look at this.
This morning's installment of our series, A More Perfect Union, examines an unexpected but powerful friendship. We're looking at unique connections to highlight how Americans have more in common than recent headlines might suggest. Steve Hartman shows us how an 82-year-old widower was touched by an innocent question in the canned food aisle of a grocery store when he needed it most.
Not long ago, in a cemetery outside Augusta, Georgia, a loving couple was buried. The wife buried below this white bouquet. The husband buried above, in a mound of grief.
Took me total death surprise.
82-year-old Dan Peterson says after Mary died, he fell into a deep depression. Spent days just staring out at the squirrels.
What were you living for?
I was trying to figure that out, frankly.
You had no purpose?
No.
Were you just waiting to die?
Yeah.
For 6 months, it was just that bad.
And then one day you go to a grocery store.
It all changed inside this Publix.
Dan was nearing the end of the canned vegetable aisle. He hates grocery shopping, and by all accounts, the expression on his face confirmed his aggravation. But that's when this unapproachable man was approached by a 4-year-old girl named Nora Wood.
In the security footage, you can see Nora randomly reaching out to him. Her mom, Tara, says it was quite embarrassing.
She stood up and said, "Hi, old person, it's my birthday today."
Old person?
Old person.
I'm an old person.
She says this to this cranky old man?
Yeah.
And then had the audacity to demand a hug.
I said, a hug? I said, absolutely.
Nora got her hug and then asked her mom to take a picture of her with her new friend.
She zeroed in on him like a missile. And she didn't want anything from him. She just wanted to make him feel loved and give him a hug. And his little lip quivered and he was teared up, and it was just sweet.
And I said, you don't know. This is the first time for quite a while that I've been as happy.
That all happened a couple months ago, and his grin has only gotten wider since.
Hi, sweetheart, come in, come in.
Today, Nora visits at least once a week,
So that's my sweetie, huh?
and every time, it's the grocery store all over again.
I knew I was going to get her. Oh, it's unbelievable. Totally unbelievable.
It's a bridge.
It's a bridge. Oh, okay.
Dan does have grandkids of his own, but they're all grown and gone. And Nora does have grandparents, but her mom says this is a completely different kind of bond that almost defies explanation.
She fell asleep holding pictures of them. What?
To Dan, it's equally miraculous, but far less mysterious. He believes Nora is, quite literally, an angel.
She opened me to loves that I didn't know existed.
Dan, let me ask you. When your wife died, you felt like you didn't have any purpose anymore. Do you feel like you have a purpose now?
Of course. No. Watching her grow up. I know I made room in my heart for a lot more.
Steve Hartman joins us now.
Oh my God, Steve.
Wow.
Jeez.
What do you think, what do you attribute this bond to?
I don't know. Nora is not one of these kids that goes out and talks to everybody she meets. This was a one-time thing, just reaching out to some random stranger in a grocery store. So this really defies explanation.
But she saw something in him when she goes up and says, old person, of all the people in the grocery store. She saw something.
And it was senior day there. There were lots of old persons
Yeah, but she
there.
walked into him.
Yes.
So why does Dan describe the bond? How does he explain it? How does he
Dan
explain it?
thinks that there's God at work here.
Yeah, I do
to be-
too.
To be blunt.
I do too.
But he also he has a message here. He thinks there's lots of other lonely old persons out there.
Yeah.
And lots of preschoolers with hugs of plenty. And he'd like to see more of them come together.
You know, Steve,
I love everything
Yeah.
Steve does. Everything you do. You said this was your favorite story.
This is
Because
anytime you get different generations falling in love with each other,
yeah.
that gets me.
What is he added to her life?
I don't know, because she's a little bit hard to talk to. She's 4. I couldn't really do an interview with her, but all I recognize is just that I was there for about an hour, and there were about at least 5 or 6 hugs.
Yeah.
So she's found something that goes beyond even a grandparent thing.
And I love her mother encouraging it too. I love that she gets to go see him once
Yes.
a week.
yeah, beautiful stories.
Really, really
Yeah.
nice.
Thank
Need
you.
another box of tissues. But
If your eyes aren't tearing after that, I don't want you to have a heart. No, life is short. It's junk time. You have a gift. We have people who are hurting. You know, I'm not a huggy person, but you have the chance to change somebody's life today by telling them that they're loved, that they're cared for. Life is junk down. It's very short, and so while you have the chance, share the gift that God has given to you. Amen. Let's pray. Lord, we look through these generations of people. They lived and then they died. They're born, they continue, and then there's an end to it. But there's nothing mentioned about the kind of lives they lived, the lives that they would endure on this earth. Lord, I pray that when people look at the annals of our history and of our lives, Lord, that they would not just see a name there, that Bruce lived on this earth and then he died, but that they would see the love of Christ. May that be the story of all of our lives, that it would be one marked with ministry ministering to those who are hurting, seeking out those who are hungry and thirsty, Lord, and providing that modicum of grace and of mercy that you have already shown to us, Lord, to share that with those who are around us, Lord, that when people look at our lives, it will be one accented with the love of Christ. May that be evident this week in our school, in our home, in our jobs. May we be reflective of your goodness to us. Lord, we thank you for these truths. We apply these to our hearts and lives throughout this week. All of this, we pray in the precious and holy name of Jesus, our Savior. And all God's people said, amen.